Ethan Miller thought the blind date was just another attempt at rebuilding trust after his marriage shattered. A warm cafe, a beautiful woman named Claire Anderson, and conversation so smooth he almost forgot how deeply he'd been wounded. Everything felt perfect until she looked straight at him, drew a long breath, and said those 4 words, "I have a child." Time seemed to freeze, not because he feared children, but because he wasn't sure if he had the courage to step forward again. Right there in that quiet corner of the coffee shop, he had to make a choice. 3 weeks earlier, Ethan had been sitting in his kitchen after putting his daughter Lily to bed when his phone buzzed. It was Ryan, his college roommate, who refused to let him disappear into single fatherhood. The text was simple. "One coffee date. That's all I'm asking. She's a friend of Sarah's. Just talk." Ethan had stared at the message for a long time before typing back a single word. Fine. Now he sat across from Claire Anderson in a corner booth at Riverside Cafe, wondering why he'd agreed to this. The cafe smelled like roasted beans and cinnamon, and afternoon light filtered through the windows in soft golden streams. Claire wore a navy sweater that made her eyes look deeper than they probably were. And when she smiled at something he said about traffic on the interstate, he noticed the way her whole face changed. She had ordered a cappuccino and held the cup with both hands, like she was warming herself, even though the cafe wasn't cold. Ethan had gone with black coffee, no sugar, the way he'd trained himself to drink it during the sleepless nights after the divorce. They'd been talking for nearly 20 minutes, and it felt surprisingly natural, not forced, not performative, just 2 people sitting in a cafe on a Thursday afternoon. Finding out they both hated small talk, but were doing it anyway. Claire worked as a graphic designer for a marketing firm downtown. She told him about a client who'd asked her to make a logo, more purple, but also more orange, and Ethan found himself laughing in a way he hadn't in months. He told her about his job managing a logistics company, the kind of work that sounded boring until you explained how one delayed shipment could collapse an entire supply chain. She listened like she actually cared, leaning forward slightly, her coffee forgotten on the table. "So, what made you say yes to this?" Claire asked, her tone light but genuine. "Blind dates aren't exactly everyone's idea of a good time." Ethan shrugged. He could have lied, could have given her some easy answer about being ready to meet new people. Instead, he found himself being honest. "A friend wouldn't stop asking," he said. "And I guess I got tired of saying no." Claire's smile softened. There was something in her expression that told him she understood what that meant. Not the words themselves, but the weight underneath them. The kind of exhaustion that came from rebuilding a life you never thought you'd have to rebuild. "I know that feeling," she said quietly. Then she took a sip of her cappuccino and changed the subject, asking him about his favorite places in the city. They talked about hiking trails neither of them had been to in years, about restaurants that had closed during the pandemic, and new ones that had taken their place. She mentioned a bookstore on 5th Street that sold used novels and served tea in mismatched mugs, and Ethan made a mental note to take Lily there sometime. The conversation moved easily, like water finding its way downhill. Claire had a way of asking questions that didn't feel intrusive, and Ethan realized he was talking more than he had in months. He told her about the logistics job, about how he'd started there right out of college and worked his way up. Through sheer stubbornness. He didn't mention the divorce yet. Neither did she mention anything about her own past. It felt like they'd made an unspoken agreement to stay in the present, at least for now. But then Claire set her cup down and looked at him in a way that made his chest tighten. Her expression shifted just slightly. The lightness in her eyes dimmed, replaced by something more serious. She folded her hands on the table, fingers laced together, and Ethan knew before she spoke that whatever came next was going to change the tone of everything. "I need to tell you something," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was a thread of tension running through it. Before this goes any further, Ethan felt his stomach drop. He'd heard that tone before. It was the tone people used right before they told you something they thought you wouldn't want to hear. He set his coffee down and met her gaze, waiting. Claire took a breath. Not a quick one, but a deep, deliberate inhale like she was steadying herself. Then she said it. "I have a child." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and undeniable. Ethan felt the world narrow to just the two of them, the noise of the cafe fading into a dull hum. He stared at her, not because he was shocked that she had a child, but because of the way she'd said it, like it was a confession, like she expected him to stand up and walk out. His mind went blank for a moment, then kicked into overdrive. She had a child. She was a single mother. That meant she'd been through something just like he had. It meant she understood what it was like to put someone else first. To carry the weight of being everything for a small person who depended on you. But it also meant complications. It meant blending lives that were already fractured. It meant two children who didn't know each other, who might not get along, who might resent the intrusion of a new person in their carefully balanced worlds. Claire was watching him, her hand still folded on the table. Her expression was calm, but there was something fragile underneath it, something that told him she'd been here before, that she'd sat across from someone and said those same 4 words and watched them find an excuse to leave. His name is Noah, she continued, her voice quieter now. He's 5. I didn't mention him earlier because I wanted to see if we even connected first. I've learned the hard way that leading with that information usually ends the conversation before it starts. Ethan opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. He wanted to tell her it was fine, that he understood, that he had a daughter, too. But the words were stuck somewhere in his throat. Because the truth was, he didn't know if it was fine. He didn't know if he was ready for this. He'd barely figured out how to be a single father to Lily. And now he was sitting across from a woman who had her own child, her own wounds, her own story. Claire's gaze didn't waver. She was still looking at him, waiting for a reaction. Waiting for him to do what everyone else had probably done. My ex-husband cheated, she said. And there was no bitterness in her voice, just facts, just the truth laid bare. He left when Noah was 2. Said he wasn't ready to be a father, that he needed to find himself or some nonsense like that. He sends a check once a month and pretends that's the same as being present. Ethan felt something crack open inside him. Not pity, not sympathy, just recognition. He knew that story. He'd lived a version of it himself. I'm sorry, he said, and the words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. Claire gave him a small, tired smile. The kind of smile that said she'd heard those words before and they didn't change anything. It's fine, she said. I've made peace with it. But I needed you to know before we kept talking because if you're going to walk away, I'd rather you do it now. Ethan sat there, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, and tried to figure out what he was supposed to say. He thought about Lily, about the way she'd cried the first night after her mother left, about how he'd held her and promised her everything would be okay, even though he didn't believe it himself. He thought about the last year, the way he'd built a life around just the 2 of them, the way he'd convinced himself that was enough. And then he thought about Claire sitting across from him with her guard up and her heart on the table, waiting for him to prove her right, waiting for him to be just another man who couldn't handle the reality of who she was. He didn't say anything. He just sat there staring at his coffee, trying to sort through the mess in his head. And in that silence, Claire's expression shifted. The fragile hope that had been there a moment ago faded, replaced by resignation. She straightened her shoulders and reached for her purse. If you want to leave because I have a child, Claire began, her voice tight with control, then I'd rather you just say it now. She didn't finish the sentence because Ethan cut her off before she could. I'm not going anywhere, he said. The words came out harder than he intended, almost sharp. Claire's hand stopped halfway to her purse. She looked at him like she wasn't sure she'd heard him correctly, like maybe he'd misspoken or she'd misunderstood. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his coffee forgotten, and forced himself to hold her gaze. I'm not leaving, he repeated, softer this time. I just needed a second to process. Claire's expression shifted. The resignation that had been there a moment ago cracked, replaced by something more vulnerable. She lowered her hand back to the table, but she didn't relax. She was still waiting for the catch, the condition, the inevitable excuse that would follow his words. Ethan ran a hand through his hair and let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He needed to say this, right? He needed her to understand that his silence wasn't rejection, even if it looked like it. I have a daughter, he said finally. Her name is Lily. She's 7. Claire blinked. The shift in her expression was subtle but unmistakable. Surprise, followed by something that looked like relief, followed by a guarded curiosity. She didn't say anything, so Ethan kept going. My ex-wife left a year ago, he continued. She said she wasn't happy, that she needed space, that being a mother wasn't what she thought it would be. So, she walked out. And now I'm raising Lily on my own. He watched Claire's face as he spoke, saw the way her shoulders dropped slightly, the tension easing just enough to tell him she understood. She wasn't the only one carrying weight. She wasn't the only one who'd been left to pick up the pieces. So when you said you have a child, Ethan said, his voice steady now. I didn't hesitate because I'm scared of kids. I hesitated because I don't know if I'm ready to risk getting hurt again, or worse, if I'm ready to risk hurting you or our kids. Claire's eyes were bright and for a moment Ethan thought she might cry, but she didn't. She just nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. And when she spoke, her voice was softer than it had been all afternoon. I get it, she said. I really do. They sat there in the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. Outside the cafe window, a city bus rolled past, its brakes hissing. Someone at the counter laughed at something the barista said. The espresso machine whirred. But inside their corner booth, the world felt smaller, quieter, like it had contracted to just the two of them. Ethan wrapped his hands around his coffee cup again, even though it had gone lukewarm. He thought about what he wanted to say next. How to bridge the gap between honesty and hope without sounding naive. I'm not saying this is going to be easy, he said. I don't even know what this is yet, but I'm saying I'm willing to try. If you are. Claire looked at him for a long moment like she was trying to decide whether to believe him. Then slowly, a smile broke across her face. It wasn't a big smile. Not the kind that lit up the room. It was small and fragile and real. The kind of smile that came from a place deeper than politeness or performance. I haven't had someone say that in a long time, she said quietly. Usually the second I mention Noah, they find a reason to leave or they stay. But look at me like I'm damaged goods. Like being a single mom makes me less than. Ethan shook his head. He wanted to tell her that wasn't true, that anyone who thought that way wasn't worth her time. But he knew words like that wouldn't mean much coming from someone she'd just met. So instead, he just said their loss. Claire's smile widened just a fraction. She reached for her cappuccino, realized it was cold, and set it back down with a soft laugh. So, she said, her tone lighter now. Tell me about Lily. Ethan felt something loosen in his chest. He told Claire about his daughter, about how she loved dinosaurs and refused to eat anything green except pickles. He told her about the bedtime routine they'd established. The way Lily insisted on 3 stories every night and always fell asleep before the third one ended. He told her about the time Lily had tried to build a treehouse in their backyard using nothing but duct tape and cardboard boxes and how he'd spent an entire Saturday helping her reinforce it so it wouldn't collapse. Claire listened with the same attention she'd given him earlier. But now there was something else in her eyes, something warm. She told him about Noah, about how he was obsessed with superheroes and wore a cape to preschool every single day. She told him about the time Noah had tried to fly off the couch and sprained his wrist and how she'd had to explain to the emergency room doctor that no, she wasn't a negligent parent. Her son just had an overactive imagination. They laughed and it felt good. It felt normal, like maybe they could do this, like maybe 2 broken people with complicated lives and kids who didn't know each other could find a way to make something work. Ethan was about to suggest they order another round of coffee when the door to the cafe opened, letting in a gust of cold air and the sound of traffic from the street. He barely noticed, but Claire did. Her entire body went rigid, her smile vanishing so fast it was like someone had flipped a switch. Ethan followed her gaze to the entrance and saw a man standing just inside the doorway. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with the kind of build that suggested he'd played sports in college, and still thought of himself as an athlete. He wore a charcoal jacket over a white shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and his dark hair was styled in a way that looked effortless but probably wasn't. His eyes scanned the cafe, landing on Claire, and his expression shifted into something smug. "Mark," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't need her to explain. He could see it in the way she'd gone completely still. The way her hands had clenched into fists on the table. This was the ex-husband, the one who cheated, the one who'd walked out when Noah was 2. Mark crossed the cafe in a few long strides, ignoring the other customers, his focus locked on Claire. When he reached their booth, he stopped and looked down at them with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Claire," he said, his tone mockingly pleasant. Didn't expect to see you here. Claire didn't respond. She just stared at him, her jaw tight. Ethan could see the way her breathing had changed, shallow and controlled, like she was trying to keep herself from falling apart. Mark's gaze shifted to Ethan, giving him a quick once-over. Then he let out a low chuckle, the kind of sound that was meant to belittle. "So, this is what you're doing now?" Mark said, directing the question at Claire, but keeping his eyes on Ethan. "Blind dates." Ethan felt his stomach clench. He didn't like the way Mark was standing there. Didn't like the way he was talking to Claire like she was something to be mocked, but he stayed quiet, waiting to see how this would play. Claire finally found her voice. It came out steady, but Ethan could hear the tremor underneath. "What are you doing here, Mark?" Mark shrugged, still smiling. He gestured vaguely toward the counter. "Getting coffee." Didn't realize this place was off limits now. His tone was light, conversational, but there was an edge to it, like he was enjoying this, like he'd walked in here and found exactly what he'd been hoping for. He turned his attention fully to Ethan now, sizing him up in a way that was meant to be obvious. Then he let out another laugh, shaking his head. "Did she tell you?" Mark asked, his voice loud enough that a few people at nearby tables turned to look. "Did she tell you she has a kid?" The cafe went quiet. Not completely, but enough that Ethan could feel the weight of people's attention shifting toward them. Claire's face had gone pale, her eyes wide with something close to panic. She looked at Ethan, then at Mark, then back at Ethan, like she was waiting for the inevitable collapse. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. This was the moment. This was where Mark expected him to falter, to make an excuse, to prove that he was just like every other man who'd walked away from Claire. The second, things got complicated. Mark leaned against the edge of the booth, crossing his arms, his smug expression fixed in place. "Yeah, that's what I thought," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Most guys don't want to deal with someone else's baggage. Can't say I blame them." Claire looked like she'd been struck. Her hands were shaking now, gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles had turned white. She didn't say anything. She couldn't. And Ethan realized in that horrible stretched-out second that this wasn't the first time Mark had done this to her. This wasn't the first time he'd shown up and humiliated her in public, reminded her of all the ways she wasn't enough. The air in the cafe felt heavy, suffocating. A woman at the counter whispered something to her companion. The barista had stopped mid-pour, watching. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Ethan looked at Claire, saw the way she was barely holding herself together, and something inside him snapped. Not anger, not rage, just a cold, clear certainty that this moment mattered more than anything else. He pushed his chair back and stood up. Mark straightened, his smile widening, like this was exactly what he'd been waiting for, like he expected Ethan to throw some cash on the table, mumble an apology, and walk out. But Ethan didn't move toward the door. He moved toward Mark. Ethan stopped directly in front of Mark, close enough that the other man had to tilt his chin up slightly to maintain eye contact. The cafe had gone completely silent now. Even the espresso machine seemed to have quieted as if the entire room was holding its breath. Mark's smirk faltered for just a second before reasserting itself. He straightened his shoulders, clearly not expecting Ethan to step into his space like this. He'd expected retreat. He'd expected exactly what Claire had probably seen a dozen times before. Another man backing down, making excuses, disappearing into the crowd. "Something you want to say?" Mark asked, his tone still casual, but with an edge of challenge underneath. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he spoke, his words were calm and deliberate. Loud enough for the cafe to hear, but controlled enough that they didn't sound like a threat. "I know," Ethan said simply. Mark blinked, his smirk wavered again, confusion flickering across his face. "You know what?" Mark asked. Ethan held his ground, his expression unreadable. "I know she has a child," he said. "She told me 20 minutes ago, and I'm still sitting here." The words landed like stones in still water. Mark's face shifted, the smugness draining away, replaced by something closer to uncertainty. He glanced past Ethan toward Claire, who was still sitting at the booth, her hands gripping the table's edge. Then he looked back at Ethan, trying to reassemble his confidence. "Yeah, well," Mark said, his voice losing some of its earlier bravado. "Give it a few months. You'll see what I mean." Kids complicate everything. You'll get tired of it. Ethan felt something cold settle in his chest. Not anger, just clarity. He thought about Lily, about the nights he'd stayed up when she had nightmares, about the way she'd wrap her arms around his neck and tell him she loved him. He thought about Claire sitting behind him, trying not to fall apart in front of a room full of strangers. And he thought about Noah, a 5-year-old boy who didn't ask to be born into this mess but was carrying it anyway. "No," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I won't." Mark let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Come on, man," he said. "You don't even know her. You don't know what you're signing up for." Ethan took a step closer. Not aggressive, just deliberate. Mark flinched just barely, and that small movement told Ethan everything he needed to know about who this man really was. "You're right," Ethan said. "I don't know her that well yet, but I know enough to see that she deserves better than what you gave her, and I'm willing to give her and her child a family, not walk away like you did." The cafe erupted in a wave of whispered reactions. Someone near the counter let out a quiet, "Oh my God." A woman by the window turned to her companion and muttered something Ethan couldn't hear. Mark's face went red, his jaw tightening, and for a moment, Ethan thought the man might actually take a swing at him, but Mark didn't. Instead, he just stood there, his mouth opening and closing like he was searching for a comeback that wouldn't come. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, then relaxed. He looked around the cafe, saw the way people were staring at him, and something in his expression crumbled. "Whatever," Mark muttered, his voice tight. "You two deserve each other." He turned on his heel and walked toward the door, his stride stiff and angry. The door swung open, letting in another gust of cold air. And then Mark was gone. The bell above the entrance chimed once, cheerful and incongruous, and then the cafe fell silent again. Ethan stood there for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt the weight of everyone's attention on him, felt the stares and the whispers, and suddenly he was exhausted. He turned back toward the booth and saw Claire sitting there, her hands still gripping the table, her eyes wide and glassy with unshed tears. He crossed the space between them in 3 steps, and slid back into his seat. Claire was staring at him like she just watched something impossible happen, like she didn't quite believe he was real. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan shook his head. "Yes, I did." Claire's composure finally broke. A tear slid down her cheek, then another, and she wiped them away quickly with the back of her hand. She let out a shaky breath and looked down at the table like she couldn't quite meet his eyes. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know he'd be here. I swear I didn't." Ethan reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. She flinched just slightly, then relaxed. Her fingers were cold. "You don't have to apologize," he said. "None of that was your fault." Claire looked up at him. And the expression on her face was something Ethan would remember for the rest of his life. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't relief. It was something deeper, something more fragile. It was trust. The kind of trust that had been beaten down and buried and was now slowly, carefully beginning to surface again. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. Ethan gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "You don't have to say anything." They sat like that for a moment, the noise of the cafe gradually returning to normal around them. The barista resumed making drinks. The woman by the window went back to her conversation. The couple at the counter paid for their order and left. Life moved on the way it always did. Indifferent to the small, quiet moments that changed everything. Claire finally pulled her hand back and wiped her eyes again. She let out a soft, self-deprecating laugh. "This is probably the worst first date you've ever been on," she said. Ethan smiled. A real smile this time. "It's definitely the most memorable." Claire laughed again, and this time it sounded genuine. She picked up her cold cappuccino, realized it was still undrinkable, and set it back down with a grimace. "So," she said, her voice stronger now. "Where do we go from here?" Ethan thought about that. He thought about Lily and Noah, about blending 2 broken families into something that might resemble whole. He thought about the risks, the complications, the 1,000 ways this could go wrong. But he also thought about the way Claire had looked at him when he stood up to Mark. The way she'd held his hand like it was the only solid thing in a room full of chaos. "How about we start with dinner?" he said. "Somewhere that's not here." Claire's smile was small but real. She nodded. "I'd like that." They stood up together, leaving their cold coffees behind. Ethan dropped a $20 bill on the table, more than enough to cover both drinks and a generous tip. As they walked toward the door, Claire reached for his hand, her fingers laced through his, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Outside, the late afternoon sun was starting to dip behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint smell of exhaust and roasted nuts from a street vendor down the block. Claire stopped just outside the cafe and turned to face him. "Thank you," she said, "for staying, for standing up for me, for not being like him." Ethan shook his head. "You don't have to thank me for doing what anyone decent would do." Claire's expression softened. "You'd be surprised how rare decent is." They walked down the street together, past storefronts with autumn displays in the windows, past people rushing home from work, past the ordinary chaos of a Thursday evening in the city. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the quiet understanding that they'd both crossed some invisible line, and there was no going back now. Ethan thought about what came next. He thought about introducing Lily to Claire, about meeting Noah, about navigating the complicated logistics of two single parents trying to build something new. He thought about all the ways it could fail, all the ways their pasts could catch up with them and tear everything apart. But he also thought about the way Claire's hand felt in his. The way she'd looked at him when he chose to stay. The way her smile had returned, fragile but real after Mark had tried to destroy it. They reached the corner where they'd have to decide which direction to go. Claire stopped and looked up at him, her eyes searching his face like she was still trying to figure out if this was real. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly. Ethan nodded. "Me, too." Claire squeezed his hand. "But you're still here." Ethan smiled. "Yeah, I'm still here." And in that moment, standing on a street corner as the sun set behind them and the city moved on around them, Ethan understood something he hadn't before. Love wasn't about finding someone without baggage. It wasn't about perfect timing or easy circumstances. It was about choosing to stay when someone showed you who they really were. It was about standing up when the world expected you to sit down. It was about building a family, not from a flawless past, but from the courage to face an uncertain future together. They walked on, their hands still clasped, heading toward whatever came next. Behind them, the cafe continued its evening rush, indifferent to the story that had just unfolded inside its walls. But for Ethan and Claire, everything had changed. The blind date that had almost ended in silence had become the beginning of something neither of them had been looking for, but both of them needed. A family doesn't start from a perfect past. It starts when someone chooses to stand beside you in your most difficult moment and stays.